We are now moving on to our second type of factoring, and that's where we take a trinomial, 3 terms, and we factor it, we go backwards, and make it into 2 binomials. So if you remember last unit, we took a binomial times a binomial, and we did the box method, and your final answer usually had 3 terms in it. What we're going to be doing is we're going to go backwards. We're taking that final answer and figuring out what the 2 sides of the box should be, or what those 2 binomials are going to be. And that's a process called factoring. So let's go ahead and get started with factoring. Just before we get started, I want to give you kind of the cheat sheet of this. What you're going to be doing is you're going to have to look for a set of numbers that multiplies to the last number. So in this case, we have to look for a set of numbers that can somehow multiply to be 30. And those 2 numbers also have to either add or subtract to that middle number. In this case, it'll add or subtract to 13. So multiply to this number, and they have to add or subtract to that number. And let's go ahead and get started with the first example. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at all of the different pairs of numbers that could multiply to be a 30. The easiest one is 1 and 30. It's an even number, so you could have 2, and that would match with 15. 2 times 15 is 30. We could have 3 times 10. That makes 30. And 5 times 6 would also work. So these are all of the different possible combinations that could multiply to 30. But now what I have to do is I have to find the combination that will add up to a 13. Later on, when we deal with more negative numbers, it could be add or subtract. But right now, since these are both positive, they just have to add up to a 13. So let's go through and look which ones work. If you add up 1 plus 30, that's 31. That's not going to work. I'm going to cross it off. If you add up 2 plus 15, that's 17. That one's not going to work either. If you add up 3 plus 10, well, that's a 13. Ding, 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 ding. That's the winner. That's the one that we want. So 3 and 10 is going to be the combination that we're going to use. If you tried 5 and 6, that makes 11. Not going to work. So I know that 3 plus 10 makes 13. Here's how easy the final step is. X plus 3 times x plus 10. Just rewrite them as 2 binomials. X plus 3 times x plus 10. And once again, the nice thing about this is you could always check your answer. If you were to do the box method that we described in the last unit, and you put x plus 3 here, and you did x plus 10 here, if you multiplied all of that out, your final answer would be this, x squared plus 13x plus 30. So whenever you want, you are able to check your answer by just multiplying it all out, like we did last unit. Let's go ahead and do one more example. Again, this one involves all positive numbers, so we're just looking at adding. So we're going to look at what numbers could somehow multiply and make a 40. So 1 and 40, 2 and 20. 3 doesn't work, but we could do 4 times 10. And lastly, we have a 5 times 8. So there's 4 different sets of numbers that could make a 40. Now we go through and we find out which one could add up to make a 22. I think you probably already know which one, but let's just figure it out. 1 and 40, that makes 41. 4 and 10, that makes 14. 5 and 8, that makes a 13. So 2 and 20, if you add those together, that makes 22. That's the one that we want. So our final answer will be x plus 2 times x plus 20. You might be worried about the order. Like if you wrote x plus 20 and x plus 2, that would also work. The order does not matter. So just like 10 times 2 is the same as 2 times 10, order doesn't matter. Write them however you want to. Go ahead and practice on the next 2. Make sure you understand the concept of it before we move into negative numbers. So go ahead, pause the video, and then we'll come on back in a second and deal with more negatives. All right, hopefully those two weren't so bad. Let's move on to a couple with some negative numbers. The concept will still be the exact same. We might just add some subtractions in there. So I'm going to look at all of the things that multiply to be a 22. And it could be 1 and 22, or it could be 2 and 11. Now technically it has to multiply to be negative 22. So one of these has to be a negative number. You could either have negative 2 times 11, that makes negative 22, or 2 times negative 11, that makes 22, negative 22. And I have to find the combination that will add or subtract to make a positive 9. So if I put a negative here on the 2, if you take 11 subtract 2, that makes a 9. So that's going to be the combination that we want. It's going to be x minus 2 times x plus 11. And once again, you could always distribute your answer and do the box method, and you could check, and it would end up becoming this. So there's the first example. Let's move on to the right to another one. We have x squared minus 7x plus 10. We're going to look at the last number here. We're going to look at the 10. And we're going to look at all of the things that could multiply to be a 10. It could be 1 and 10, or it could be 2 and 5. Now, which combination of numbers do you think could possibly add or subtract to make a negative 7? Well, 1 and 10, if you add them, you get 11. If you subtract them, you get a 9. It won't be that one. But if you take 2 and 7, hey, that makes us 2 and 5, that makes a 7. That's the one we're looking for. But there's a little difference here. We want it to make a negative 7. So how could I combine these two to make a negative 7? That's right. You make them both negative. If you multiply negative 2 times negative 5, it still makes a positive 10. Two negatives multiply to make a positive. But if you add them together, negative 2 combined with negative 5, it makes a negative 7, which is what we were looking for. So your final answer is x minus 2 times x minus 5. And there it is. Couple more examples, and I think you'll start to get the hang of it. For the next one, we want to look at all of the sets of numbers that multiply to a 14. So it could be 1 and 14, or since it's an even number, you could always do 2 and 7. And I want to look at which of these sets of numbers could somehow make a negative 13 when you add them together. If you do 2 and 7, if you add those together, you get a 9. If you subtract them, you get a 5. It's not going to be 2 and 7. But I think you realize that 1 and 14, you could add them to make a 15. But if you subtract them, you've got a 13 in there. And let's see how to deal with this. You'll notice we have a negative 14. So that means one of these numbers has to be a negative. Let's try and put that negative here. Negative 1 times 14 is negative 14. That's a good thing. That's what we're looking for. But if I add them together, negative 1 plus 14, if I add these, that equals a positive 13. But I want it to make a negative 13. So it's not going to be a negative 1. But the negative is going to go on the 14. Because if you take 1 minus 14, that equals a negative 13, and that's what we were looking for. So you got to be kind of careful of where that positive goes, where the negative goes. So in this case, these are going to be your two numbers. So it'll be x plus 1 times x minus 14. And one more example. Figure out all the numbers that could multiply to be 35. We have 1 and 35. Or we also have 5 and 7. And I think if we're trying to make a 2 out of these, you know it's not going to be 1 and 35. That's not going to make a 2. But the 5 and 7, that one can make a 2. So how could I make a 2 out of 5 and 7? Because if I add them, I get 12. but I have to subtract one of them. That's right, put a minus on the 5. Because if you take -5 plus 7, it equals a positive 2. These two numbers, they still multiply to -35, and they add up to a positive 2. So that's my combination of numbers, and we're going to write it as x minus 5 times x plus 7. And this is your final answer. So be very, very, very careful, especially when it comes to those negatives. I do have a little cheat sheet down here, and I'm not going to explain it so much right now, but basically you look at the last number if it's positive, and then look at the middle term, and it kind of gives you an example of how those signs go in each one. So feel free to look at that as kind of a guide if you'd like, but you can look at that on your own time and maybe use it as a reference as you are trying the ones on your own. The password for this assignment is going to be madness, because it is March Madness right now. There's a big basketball tournament going on. So madness, M-A-D-N-E-S-S. There's your password. Go ahead and submit these 6 into Schoology, and then you're set. So we've now learned 2 different methods of factoring. Hopefully you're getting good at those. Next week we'll do special cases, and then you'll have your last test of the quarter. Hooray.